This video is on attribute routing. In this video we will talk about attribute routing versus conventional routing, and URL generation part 2. Attribute routing uses a set of attributes to map actions to route templates. If we open up our startup.cs, we'll see our conventional route here for blog. Let's take this out and replace it with an attribute-based route. In the controllers folder, open up blogcontroller.cs, and on the line immediately before the story action, add the attribute. The route attribute takes a path, and as we saw before, we want this path to be blog/id, and id is an int. As you can see, it takes the same string template that we used in our conventional route. Now if we save the file and hit F5, the application will start up as normal. And in the URL, we can navigate to blog/123, and you can see that we get the same result, 123 on the page. But we can go further. You can have multiple route attributes on an action. Let's change our home controller to use attribute routing. In the startup, take out the route that's already defined, and we can take out this whole lambda and just have use MVC. Then in the home controller, on the index action, we can add several attributes. The first one is just route equals ... That's it. This will take care of the index action just going to the slash or root directory. Now let's add if it goes to the home folder. And finally, if it goes to home/index. Save the files and press F5 to run. The application will come up as normal. However, you'll notice if we click on privacy, nothing happens. And that's because we haven't added an attribute route to privacy. But we can fix that by going to privacy and adding an attribute for it. Then restart our application and click on the privacy link. It will throw our exception from earlier. As you can see, attribute routing supports multiple routes that reach the same location. Although you can add multiple routes on actions, it's best to keep URLs simple and well defined in your application. Reserve this tool for backwards compatibility with old routing schemes. Attribute routing requires precise control of which route templates apply to each action. With attribute routing, the controller name and action name play no part in which action is selected. For example, if we go back to our blog controller, we can change this or add another route, and as you can see, My Super Blog has nothing to do with the name blog controller. And yet, if we run the application and navigate to My Super Blog /123, the blog entry for 123 appears on the screen. Attribute routing isn't limited to the route attribute. There's also HTTP verb attributes. For example, here on index, we can change this from route to HTTP GET. There's also HTTP post, put, patch, options, head, and delete. We won't look at those in this video. You can also combine routes. To make routing less repetitive, route attributes can be applied on the controller and combined with those on the actions. For example, here we have the root, home, and home/index. We can get rid of the home and place it on the top level controller, specifying that the route home goes to the home controller. Pressing F5 again will show that this works. Now, why did it go to 404 when we were at the root page? That's because we didn't specify the root. We just said blank. We need to be very explicit and specify HTTP GET / in order to get the root. Now if we restart the app, loading the root gets us to the welcome page. In attribute routing, the order doesn't matter because routing builds a tree and matches all routes simultaneously. It always orders them from most specific to most generic. This can be overridden with the order property though, but this should be avoided if at all possible. To make attribute routing behave more like conventional routing, there is token replacement available. For example, up here our route is called home, but it's on the home controller. It's a bit redundant. We can simply change this to use token replacement by changing this to controller with square brackets around it. And same thing with our index action. Now if we save it and run it, you can see that the page loads normally. Attribute routing versus conventional routing. You can mix these two styles of routing. You don't need to choose one or the other. Typically, you would use attribute routing for REST APIs and conventional routing for HTML pages. Actions that define attribute routes cannot be reached through conventional routes, and the reverse is true too. Any route attribute on the controller makes all actions in the controller attribute routed. That means if we go back to our startup.cs class and undo this change, giving us back to conventional routes, and go to our home controller and remove the privacy attribute, you'll find that we can't get to the privacy action. It just goes home, which is to the root page. Let's take out this conventional routing so we can look at some more attribute routing features. Go back to the home controller, and on privacy, add an HTTP GET attribute that points to action, the action token. Now if you recall from the last video, we created this link action, and this link action creates a link that we print out to the screen for the privacy action. We currently can't get to it because there isn't an attribute on it. Let's add an attribute now. Now we can get to link. If we press F5 and navigate to home/link, you can see that it still creates the same home/privacy link that we had before. There's another way of doing this. Go back to Visual Studio Code and stop the debugging. In the HTTP GET, we can also add a name field, and we'll call this products list. Save it. Route names are used when generating URLs based on specific routes. Names have no impact on the URL matching behavior. Names must be unique throughout the entire application. The iURL helper interface is infrastructure between MVC and the routing engine. A second way of creating this link up here, instead of using the link generator that we injected into the controller earlier, let's use this URL action and specify the name of the action. In this case, we want privacy. Output this URL instead of the link and press F5. Now when we navigate to home/link, we get the same URL that we got before. But what about this name? How can we use this name to generate a URL? Since it's unique across the entire application, it should be simple, and it is. Instead of URL.action, we specify URL.routeURL and pass in the name. In this case, products list. Press F5 to begin. Navigate to home/link, and the URL is still there. But what if we want an absolute URL? We can pass in a string protocol, and in this case we want to use request.scheme, restart the application, and navigate to home/link, and we get a fully qualified domain name. That's all there is to it to URL generation. In this video you learned about attribute routing versus conventional routing, and a second way of doing URL generation. Please stay with us for the next video, which is on working with controllers. This video is on attribute routing. In this video we will talk about attribute routing versus conventional routing, and URL generation part 2. Attribute routing uses a set of attributes to map actions to